December in this town makes people lie nicer. My name is Donna, and I walked into Christmas dinner expecting a family reunion, but I found an ambush waiting between the crystal glasses. The document on the table was poison wrapped in polite ink, demanding I sign away my future to cover their theft. They thought I would break because I always had. But they didn't know the trembling old woman at the head of the table had already handed me the match. This is the story of how I stopped being the daughter they owned and started being the stranger they feared. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. December in this town doesn't sparkle, it just gets flat. The sky turns the color of a bruised dime and stays that way until March. The snow doesn't drift. It sits in the gutters like old cigar ash, hard and gray and impossible to shovel. I drove past the town square on my way home from work, watching the municipal decorations shiver in the wind. They looked tired. I felt about the same. I work in a cubicle that smells like toner and carpet cleaner, payroll, billing, scheduling. It's a job with hard edges. I like it because it lives in numbers and deadlines. You can't argue with a spreadsheet. A column of figures doesn't care if you had a bad childhood or if you're trying your best. It just sums up to a truth. I learned early that numbers don't flatter you, but they don't lie to you either. In my family, that makes them a rarity. My parents have a story they tell about me. It's a polished script rehearsed over 30 years of dinners and holidays. In their version, I am the stubborn one, the ungrateful daughter, the one who is hard to love. They say it with a sigh, like my personality is a weather condition they have to endure. My sister Claire is the opposite in their story. She is always trying. She is under pressure. She needs support. If Claire borrows money and doesn't pay it back, she's a victim of circumstances. If I decline a Sunday dinner because I'm working overtime, I'm being dramatic. If I speak up, I'm aggressive. If I stay quiet, I'm hiding something. I learned a long time ago that you can't win a game where the other side writes the rules while you're playing. Grandma Marlene Crawford was the only adult in the room who didn't play games. Grandma didn't do sentimental talk. She didn't bake cookies to make you like her. She dealt in checklists, receipts, and clean hands. She came from money that didn't need to shout. It was old money tied up in land, a diversified portfolio, and a small family foundation that sat quietly in the background of the county's economy. She loved me, but not like a project. She looked at me like I was a person. She respected that I paid my own rent. She respected that I didn't ask for things. The invitation came 3 days before Christmas. My mother called me at 7:00 p.m., a time she knows I'm usually eating dinner. She spoke with that breathless, airy tone she uses when she wants to pretend we're friends. She said Grandma wanted all of us together for Christmas dinner at their house. The big house on the hill. The one with the mortgage my father complains about but won't refinance. I don't know, Mom, I said, holding my phone away from my ear. I'm tired. The end of the year is heavy at work. My mother didn't beg. Begging would imply I had power. Instead, she used a soft threat. Grandma is getting older, Donna. You don't know how many of these we have left. You'll regret it if you don't come. That word, regret. It was bait. My mother knows I still have a tender place where guilt lives, a small patch of soft tissue she can still pinch. I told her I'd let her know. I hung up and stared at the dark window. Then came the second message. This was the one that changed everything. It was a voicemail from Grandma Marlene. I saw the notification and felt a strange prickle on the back of my neck. Grandma didn't call just to chat. I put the phone to my ear. Her voice was clear, stripped of any holiday warmth. Be there, she said. Don't sign anything. Bring your clear head. Click. She didn't say I love you. She didn't ask how I was. She gave me 3 commands. Be there. Don't sign anything. Bring your clear head. My stomach went cold. It felt like I'd swallowed a stone. Grandma Marlene was precise. She did not speak in riddles, and she did not give warnings unless there was a fire. If she was telling me not to sign anything, it meant someone was going to ask me to. I sat on my couch for a long time. I realized I wasn't going to the dinner because I wanted to see my parents. I wasn't going because I missed the house or the food. I was going because I wanted my grandmother. That's the difference between love and hunger. My parents had hunger for status, for control, for money. I just wanted the one person who knew who I was. I told myself I would go. I would eat. I would smile. I would leave. I told myself I was strong. But strength is easy when nobody is actively trying to break you. The day of the dinner, I tried to anchor myself in the real world. I baked a batch of cookies not for my family, but for Mrs. Gable next door. I dropped them off and stood on her porch for 10 minutes, listening to her talk about her hip surgery. It was mundane and real. Later, I texted a coworker offering to cover her morning shift on the 26th so she could watch her kids' school play. These little acts were my armor. They reminded me that I was a functional human being, a member of a community where people didn't ask you to bleed just to prove loyalty. I needed to remember that family can be chosen because I was about to walk into the one I was stuck with. At 5:00 p.m., I started my practical preparations. I didn't dress up to impress them. I dressed to be armored. Heavy wool sweater, dark slacks, boots. I charged my phone to 100%. I put $200 cash in my pocket just in case I needed a cab or a motel. Then I did something that made me hate myself. I logged into my banking app and took screenshots of my balances. I pulled up my credit report and screenshotted that too. I looked like a paranoid person. But paranoid people are usually made that way on purpose. Finally, I took a photo of my driver's license and texted it to my best friend Sarah. Heading to my parents. If I don't answer by 9, call me. Okay, she texted back immediately. Be safe. I hate that I had to do it. I hate that safety was a consideration for Christmas dinner. But I did it anyway. I arrived at the house at 6. My parents' house was dressed up like innocence itself. A massive wreath hung on the door. Electric candles flickered in every window. Soft jazz drifted out into the cold air. I walked up the driveway, my boots crunching on the salt. My mother opened the door before I could knock. She hugged me, holding on for a second too long. It was a performance for an audience of nobody. Donna. You made it. Hi, Mom. My father was in the hallway holding a drink. He looked at me over the rim of his glass like I was a bill he was tired of paying. You're late, he said. I wasn't. I was 5 minutes early. Traffic, I said. Claire bounced into the hallway. She smiled wide, showing teeth, but the smile stopped at her mouth. Her eyes were sharp, scanning me for weakness. Merry Christmas, Donna. I love that sweater. It's so practical. And then I saw Grandma. She was sitting at the end of the dining table, already a cup of tea in front of her. She sat upright, her spine not touching the back of the chair. She was watching everything. I walked over to her, feeling the relief wash over me. I went to kiss her cheek. Hello, Grandma, I said warmly. She didn't lean into it. She stayed rigid. She looked at me with eyes as cold as the December gutters. You hung your coat on the guest hook, Donna, she snapped. Her voice was loud enough to carry to the kitchen. The family hooks are in the closet. Honestly, you're 30 years old. Can't you follow a simple system? I froze. It landed hard. Grandma never corrected me in public. She never cared about coat hooks. It felt like a slap. I stepped back confused. I didn't realize. You never realize, she said, turning her head away. Just fix it, and don't stomp. I grabbed my coat, my face burning. I looked toward the kitchen. My mother and father were watching. And then I saw it. They relaxed. My father's shoulders dropped 3 inches. My mother exchanged a quick, satisfied glance with Claire. They had been tense, waiting to see whose side Grandma was on. Now they thought they knew. They thought Grandma was finally tired of me. They thought she was finally on their side. I moved my coat to the closet, my hands shaking slightly. But as I closed the closet door, the coldness in my stomach shifted into something else. Focus. Grandma Marlene didn't care about coats. She didn't get petty. This cold grandma wasn't random cruelty. It was a signal. It was controlled misdirection. She was playing a part to lower their guard, which meant the voicemail was the only truth I had to hold on to. Be there. Don't sign. clear head. I walked back into the dining room. I didn't apologize again. I sat down, kept my back straight, and waited for the war to start. The pressure started before the oven timer even dinged. We were standing in the living room holding heavy crystal tumblers that felt like weapons in our hands. My mother was standing next to Claire, her hand resting protectively on my sister's shoulder. She was beaming a tight, stretched expression that made her eyes crinkle. "It's just been such a big year for Claire," my mother announced loud enough for Grandma to hear from her chair. "Expanding the business, taking risks. It takes so much courage." I took a sip of water. I knew for a fact that Claire's boutique had been in the red for 18 months, and that she was currently dodging calls from 2 different vendors. But in this house, debt was just expansion, and failure was just bravery. My father was pacing near the fireplace, swirling his scotch. He wasn't looking at us. He was looking at the ceiling, or maybe through it. "It's about legacy," he said, his voice deep and stage-managed. "Tonight is about cementing family unity, ensuring that what we've built stays protected." He looked at me when he said protected. I was the threat. I was the leak in the hull. I was treated not like a daughter but like a guest who had forgotten to bring a gift and had tracked mud on the carpet. Claire looked at me with a tragic, wet-eyed expression. She let her voice shake just a little. "I've just been so overwhelmed. You know it's hard when you feel like you're carrying the weight alone." I didn't take the bait. I scanned the room instead. I read the room like a ledger, looking for the things that didn't add up. There was an extra chair at the table. 6 settings, 5 of us. On the mahogany sideboard, pushed behind a silver tray of deviled eggs, was a black leather folio. It was thick, expensive. It wasn't a photo album. Next to it, a stack of papers sat aligned with military precision. Nobody aligns papers that neatly for a cranberry sauce recipe. The air in the room felt pressurized, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Then the doorbell rang. It was sharp and intrusive against the soft jazz. My father moved instantly, setting his drink down with a clatter. "That must be Ms. Keller." He opened the door to reveal a woman in a structured gray wool coat. She carried a slim briefcase and wore shoes with sensible heels that made no sound on the hardwood. She didn't look like a dinner guest. She looked like a billable hour. "Everyone, this is Ms. Keller," my father said, ushering her in like she was a prize he had won at a fair. "She's been helping Mom get organized, just some administrative things." Grandma nodded once from her chair. She didn't smile. She didn't offer a greeting. My mother chimed in, her voice high and thin. "Just routine paperwork, really. We thought we'd get it out of the way before we eat so we can all relax." I tightened my grip on my glass. Nobody drags routine to a Christmas dinner. Nobody hires a professional in a wool coat to watch you eat turkey unless they need a witness. They didn't start with the documents. They started with the story. They ushered us to the table, but we didn't eat. The plates were empty. Ms. Keller sat in the extra chair, opening her briefcase with a quiet click-click that sounded like a gun being cocked. "Donna," my mother began. She clasped her hands on the tablecloth. "We're worried about you." "We feel you've been distant," my father added. He leaned forward. "You've always had trouble with responsibility, with understanding how a family operates as a unit." "I pay my own bills," I said. My voice was calm, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. "I have a job. I have a life." "A small life," Claire whispered. "We want more for you. We want you to be part of the future." They were building a little courtroom right there between the candlesticks. I was the defendant, and the verdict had been written before I parked my car. Then Grandma spoke. "Donna has been difficult," Grandma said. She stared at the centerpiece, refusing to meet my eyes. Her voice was flat, cold. The room seemed to warm up around my parents. They practically exhaled in unison. They had been afraid Grandma would defend me, but now she had thrown the first stone. I felt something crack inside me, quietly, like ice fracturing in a glass of warm water. I had expected them to come for me. I hadn't expected her to hold the door open for them. Ms. Keller slid a thick packet of paper across the polished wood. It stopped directly in front of me. The title was printed in a soft, non-threatening serif font, Acknowledgement and Family Settlement Agreement. It's just formalities, my father said, waving a hand dismissively. It keeps things simple. After, well, you know, when the time comes. Sign it, my mother said, smiling that terrible tight smile. Sign it and we can move forward. We can have a nice Christmas. Why would you fight this? Claire asked. It's what Grandma wants. Look at her. I looked at Grandma. She was stone. I looked down at the paper. I didn't just glance at it. I read it. Because Donna is not stupid. The legal jargon was dense poison wrapped in polite ink, but the meaning was clear. Clause 4. I would waive any and all future claims to Grandma's estate and trust. Clause 7. I agreed not to contest any future amendments made to her will. Clause 9. I agreed to keep all family financial matters strictly confidential under penalty of litigation, and then clipped to the back a separate page. A personal loan guarantee. It listed a staggering amount of debt attached to Claire's business entity, and it listed me as a guarantor. They wanted me to sign away my inheritance and co-sign Claire's failure, and they wanted it notarized tonight. At dinner, like a hostage note. You're reading too much into it, my father said, his patience thinning. You're always so suspicious. It's standard. You're ruining Christmas, my mother said. Her voice cracked. We just want everyone safe. You never support me, Claire hissed. You're jealous because I'm actually trying to build something. Grandma stayed quiet, watching. I placed my hand flat on the packet and slid it back toward the center of the table. No, I said. My father blinked. Excuse me. I don't sign legal documents in a dining room, I said. And I certainly don't guarantee business loans for companies I don't own. I kept my voice flat. They feed on emotion. If I yelled, they could call me unstable. If I cried, they could call me weak. I gave them nothing. My mother's face hardened. The mask of concern fell away, revealing the iron underneath. Then tell us where the missing money went, Donna. My father reached into the folio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slammed it down in front of me. We have proof. We know you've been taking advantage of Grandma. It was a printout. It looked official. It had a bank logo at the top, but the formatting was wrong. The font was slightly off. It showed a transfer of $50,000. We know you coerced her, Claire said quickly. Too quickly, like she had memorized the line. We know you took it. If you're innocent, my father said, leaning in, you'll sign the waiver. You'll sign the guarantee to pay it back. We can handle this within the family. Or, we can involve the authorities. They said the quiet part out loud. Sign the paper, or we frame you. I looked at the fake document. I looked at my father's red face, and then Grandma spoke again. Maybe I did wrong by Donna, she said softly. The room went silent. Maybe I gave her too much. Grandma continued, her voice trembling slightly. Maybe I covered for her in the past. It sounded like a confession. It sounded like Grandma was admitting that she had protected me after I had stolen from her. It was the final nail. My parents leaned forward like wolves smelling blood. This was better than they had hoped for. Grandma wasn't just on their side, she was handing them the murder weapon. I felt 12 years old again. I felt small and dirty and accused. I wanted to scream that I had never taken a dime. I wanted to explain that I was the one who bought Grandma groceries with my own money. I wanted to beg them to believe me, but I didn't. Because begging is how they win. Then we'll handle Mom's affairs from here, my father said, his voice booming with authority. He turned to the attorney. We need to execute the power of attorney, immediately. We need full control of the accounts to stop the bleeding. We need to transfer the liquid assets, my mother added, turning to Grandma. Mom, it's for your own good. We'll move the accounts tomorrow. And the house, Claire said. We need to secure the deed before anything else happens. The greed didn't just leak out, it flooded the room. They weren't talking about protecting Grandma anymore. They were talking about stripping her clean. Ms. Keller, the attorney, watched them. She didn't write anything down. She just watched. That mattered. I took a breath. I looked at my father. If this is what Grandma wants, I asked, and if I'm the villain, why does this require a notary and a deadline? Why tonight? Nobody answered cleanly. My father opened his mouth and closed it. My mother looked at the attorney. Because we said so, my father finally shouted. I looked at Grandma. For a split second, her eyes flicked to mine. A brief, sharp flash. Good. She had wanted me to push them. She had wanted them to show their teeth. And they had. They had threatened, coerced, and attempted to defraud me and her, all in front of a witness they had brought themselves. The trap was full. Grandma put down her fork. The metal hit the china with a deliberate final clink that sounded like a gavel. She looked at my father, then at my mother, and finally at Claire. Her spine was still rigid, but the cold, confused fog she had worn all evening evaporated. Her eyes were suddenly clear, sharp. I wanted to hear you ask for control, Grandma said. I needed to hear you say the words out loud. The room went dead still. My father froze, his mouth half open. My mother's face changed, the sweetness draining out of it like water from a cracked cup. Claire's smile died mid-breath. Mom, my father asked. His voice wavered. What are you talking about? Ms. Keller. The woman in the wool coat stopped watching. She became the spine of the room. She opened the leather folio that had been sitting on the sideboard, the one my parents thought contained their victory. She didn't look at them. She looked at the papers in front of her. Mrs. Crawford's assets are not available for transfer, Ms. Keller said. Her voice was calm, professional, and absolute. They are held in a revocable living trust created 6 years ago. The terms are strict. We know about the trust, my father snapped, trying to regain his footing. That's why we need the amendment signed. She's clearly slipping. We need to step in. Mrs. Crawford is not slipping, Ms. Keller said. She slid a single document across the table. It wasn't a bank transfer. It was a physician's letter dated 2 days ago. This is a capacity evaluation. It confirms Mrs. Crawford is fully competent-oriented and acting of her own free will. Tonight's meeting was prearranged as a witnessed family conference because Mrs. Crawford suspected coercion. I am not here to notarize your documents. I am here to witness your conduct. My mother went pale. She looked at Grandma. Mom, you tricked us. Grandma looked at me. For the first time all night, her face softened into the grandmother I knew. I was cold to Donna tonight because I needed you to feel safe, she said to them. I needed you to think you were winning. Predators only behave like themselves when they think nobody can stop them. It hit me then. The criticism about the coat, the tone, the comments about mistakes. It was all bait. It hurt, but it was strategy. Even good strategy can bruise you. Ms. Keller didn't give them time to recover. She laid out the evidence. It was a clean, brutal chain of paper. We have records of 7 attempts by you, Robert, to access Mrs. Crawford's investment accounts without authorization, Ms. Keller said. We have the emails you sent pressuring her to get organized. We have the timeline of Claire's business debts. She placed a spreadsheet on the table. Claire is insolvent. The loan guarantee you tried to force Donna to sign wasn't for expansion. It was to cover a default judgment. Claire shrank in her chair. She didn't argue. And regarding the missing money you accused Donna of stealing, Ms. Keller continued, tapping the fake bank printout my father had slammed down earlier. This is a forgery. The actual bank statement shows no such transfer. The money never moved. You created a false instrument to extort a signature. My father stood up. His face was purple. This is outrageous. You can't speak to us like this in our own house. Mom, tell her to leave. Grandma didn't look at him. She looked at me. There is one more thing, Donna. Something I found while we were auditing the old records. Grandma nodded to Ms. Keller. The attorney pulled a thin file from the bottom of the stack. Years ago, Grandma said, her voice shaking with a specific kind of anger, Credit cards were opened in your name, a utility account, a loan application. I felt the blood drain from my face. What? Your parents, Grandma said. They used your social security number. They called it family help. They told themselves they would pay it back so it wasn't stealing. They never told you. I looked at my mother. She looked away. I looked at my father. He was staring at the wall, his jaw tight. They had used me. They had risked my future to patch the holes in their own, and they had justified it because shame is easier to carry when it belongs to someone else. I felt sick. Not surprised, just sick. Ms. Keller cleared her throat. Which brings us to the amendment. What amendment? My mother whispered. The one Mrs. Crawford executed this afternoon before coming here, Ms. Keller said. It is already filed and active. She turned the page. Effective immediately, Donna is the primary beneficiary of the Crawford Trust. She is also named successor trustee. However, given the events of tonight, I have been appointed as co-trustee to ensure her safety and to handle administrative burdens. Ms. Keller looked at my parents. Robert, Ellen, and Claire, you have been removed as beneficiaries. You can't do that, Claire screamed. It was a raw, ugly sound. It's my inheritance. Alternatively, Ms. Keller said, raising her voice slightly to cut through the noise. Mrs. Crawford has included a conditional clause. You may receive a controlled monthly stipend provided you meet strict conditions. No harassment. No contact with Donna unless initiated by her. Mandatory financial counseling and restitution for the identity theft. And the kicker, Grandma said softly. The quiet clause, Ms. Keller clarified. A no contest and anti-coercion provision. If you threaten, harass, sue, or attempt fraud against the trust or Donna, your stipend drops to zero. Automatically. The funds will immediately redirect to the local animal shelter and the library foundation. If you fight, you lose everything. My father stood there breathing hard. He looked at the paperwork like it was a physical wall he couldn't punch through. I looked at them. I didn't deliver a sermon. I didn't scream about the credit cards or the lies. You tried to turn Christmas into a contract, I said. I looked at my father. You don't want peace. You want leverage. That was it. I stopped. Talking more gives them handles to grab onto. I gave them nothing else. My mother burst into tears. It was right on cue. How can you do this to us? We're family. We love you. Grandma didn't react. She sipped her tea. She's incompetent, my father yelled, pointing a shaking finger at Grandma. She doesn't know what she's signing. I'll have this overturned in court. Ms. Keller tapped the physician's letter. You will lose, and per the clause filing the suit will disinherit you completely. Go ahead, Robert. File it. Claire looked at me, her eyes wet and hateful. You're so selfish. You've always been selfish. You manipulated her. I looked at my sister. I felt nothing. No guilt. No anger. Just a profound quiet emptiness, where the obligation used to be. That was new. Grandma stood up. She was small, but she filled the room. You don't get to inherit what you tried to steal, she said. She picked up her purse. She looked at my father. We are leaving. Do not follow us. You'll regret this, my father spat. The words were heavy, dark, and desperate. Grandma paused at the doorway. She didn't look back. No, she said. You will. She walked out the front door into the cold, and I followed her, leaving the warm, bright house, and the people who claimed to love me behind. The attorney followed us out the witness to the end of my family. I drove Grandma home in her Buick. The streets were empty, the kind of hollowness that only happens on Christmas night after all the wrapping paper has been torn. The holiday lights blinking on the lampposts looked frantic in the rearview mirror, flashing red and green for nobody. The silence in the car was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the things we had just broken. When I pulled into her driveway, the adrenaline finally left me. It drained out all at once, leaving my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I stared at my knuckles, white and shaking, hating that my body was still reacting to people I had just walked away from. I turned off the engine. The silence rushed in loud and ringing. I turned to Grandma. She looked tired. The iron posture she had maintained at the dinner table had collapsed into the soft slump of an 80-year-old woman. But I couldn't let it slide. Love isn't blind obedience, and I needed the truth before I could get out of the car. "You used me as bait," I said. It wasn't a question. Grandma didn't look away. She didn't make an excuse about the greater good or try to soften it with a pat on the hand. She just nodded. "I did," she said. "I needed them to show you who they were, and I needed a witness who wasn't on the payroll." "It hurt," I said. "When you corrected me about the coat, when you looked at me like that, it hurt." "I know," she said. She reached out and touched my arm. Her hand was cold. "I'm sorry, Donna. Truly." It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't fix the past hour. But it was a real one. In my family, apologies were usually just bargaining chips or lies wrapped in sugar. This was just a fact. She had hurt me to save me. I looked at her and I realized I could live with that deal. I walked her to the door, made sure she locked it, and then drove to my apartment. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark and watched the snow fall. The next morning, the real work began. I learned quickly that freedom isn't a feeling, it's paperwork. I took the day off work, calling in sick with a family emergency that was more true than my boss could ever guess, and met Ms. Keller at her office. The office was quiet, smelling of coffee and dry erase markers. We spent 4 hours going over the mechanics of my new life. We initiated a credit freeze on all 3 bureaus. We reviewed the options for filing an identity theft report regarding the accounts my parents had opened. Ms. Keller laid it out dispassionately. I could file a police report which would likely trigger criminal investigations against my parents, or I could handle it civilly through the trust's restitution clause. I looked at the papers. I wasn't ready to send my father to jail, but I wasn't going to pay for his sins either. I chose the civil route, knowing the trust would garnish their stipend to pay off the debts they had hung around my neck. Then came the trustee education, taxes, fiduciary duty, record-keeping, distributions. I realized then that money doesn't solve pain. It doesn't erase the memory of your mother looking at you like a stranger. Money just buys you the space to heal without having to beg for it. It buys you a door you can lock. By noon, the retaliation campaign had started. It began with a text from an aunt I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. "Your mother is devastated. How could you do this to family on Christmas? Then a cousin. I heard you manipulated Grandma." That's low, Donna. My parents were controlling the story. They were calling everyone in the Rolodex, spinning a narrative where I was the predator, and they were the blindsided victims. They were stripping out the context, the coercion, the theft, the lies, and leaving only the result. I had the money, and they didn't. Claire took it to the internet. I saw the notification pop up. A vague, passive-aggressive post on social media. "Some people will sell their soul for a payout. Heartbroken by the betrayal in my own family. Hold your loved ones close, even the snakes." I typed out a reply. I wanted to scream. I wanted to post the screenshots of the loan guarantee and the fake bank statement. My thumb hovered over the send button. Then I deleted it. I took a screenshot of her post instead and saved it to a folder Ms. Keller had told me to create. I didn't engage. Engaging is fuel. I let the silence be my defense. That evening the doorbell rang. I flinched. It was Mrs. Gable from next door. She was holding a Tupperware container. "I saw your car was home," she said. "I made too much potato soup. I thought you might want some." She didn't ask why I was home. She didn't ask about the drama. She just handed me soup and said, "You can sit on my porch if you want some air later. I'll be out there reading." I took the soup. It was warm. "Thank you," I said. "No trouble," she said. She walked away. It was a small thing, but it broke me a little. That was what community looked like. It wasn't blood. It wasn't obligation. It was just presence. It was soup, without a contract attached. 2 hours later, the doorbell rang again. I checked the peephole. It was my mother. She was alone. She looked small on the doorstep, bundled in her expensive coat. I felt the old reflex kick in, the urge to open the door, to fix it, to smooth things over. That reflex had been installed in me since birth. I didn't open the door. I cracked it 2 inches, leaving the security chain on. "Donna," she said. Her voice was sweet. The same voice she used when she wanted me to host a holiday or lend Claire money. "Honey, can I come in? We just want to talk." "Daddy is... He's sorry," he yelled. "We're all just so stressed." She pushed against the door gently, expecting it to give. The chain went taut. "We can fix this," she said, her eyes wide and pleading through the crack. "Just come home. We'll tear up the papers. We'll forget it all happened." She was negotiating. She thought this was a haggle. She thought if she offered enough emotional currency, I would sell my safety back to her. I looked at her. I saw the fear in her eyes, but it wasn't fear of losing me. It was fear of losing the lifestyle I was supposed to subsidize. "Contact the attorney," I said. "Donna, please." "Contact the attorney," I repeated. My voice didn't shake. I closed the door. I heard her call my name, sharper this time, the sweetness slipping. I threw the deadbolt. The sound was a heavy mechanical thud that echoed in the empty apartment. I stood there for a long time, staring at the wood. I didn't open it again. I walked into the kitchen, heated up the neighbor's soup, and sat down to eat in the quiet. It was the loneliest feeling in the world, and it was the best meal I had ever had. Christmas morning didn't look like a greeting card. It looked like two people sitting in a kitchen that smelled of old wood and fresh coffee. I spent the night at Grandma's house, sleeping in the guest room under a quilt that weighed 10 pounds. When I came downstairs, Grandma was already up. She was sitting at the small breakfast table, watching a rerun of a black and white movie with the volume turned down so low it was just a murmur. There were no presents stacked on the table. There was a loaf of sourdough bread, a stick of butter, and a pot of coffee. I sat down across from her. "Toast?" she asked. "Please," I said. We ate in silence. It wasn't the heavy, loaded silence of my parents' dining room. It was comfortable. It was the silence of two people who have said everything that needed to be said and are now just resting. We didn't rehash the night before. We didn't analyze my father's shouting or my mother's tears. We didn't offer each other forced forgiveness or grand speeches about healing. We just ate toast. The peace felt strange on my skin, stiff and unfamiliar, like wearing a pair of new shoes that hadn't been broken in yet. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop for the argument to start, but the only sound was the heater kicking on. In the weeks that followed, I had to decide what to do with the freedom Grandma had handed me. It would have been easy to turn into a caricature. I could have bought a flashy car, or booked a flight to an island where the water is clear enough to read a newspaper through. But I didn't. I learned that wealth isn't about buying loud things, it's about quieting the noise. I took my old sedan to the shop and told the mechanic to fix everything. The rattle in the muffler, the soft brakes, the heater that only worked on high. I paid the bill without checking my bank balance 3 times. That was the first time I felt rich. I paid off my student loans. I paid off the credit card debt that had been hanging over me like a low ceiling. I started seeing a therapist who didn't look at me with pity, but with clinical detachment, helping me unpack 30 years of conditioning. I put the rest of the money into an emergency fund and low-risk bonds. I learned the difference between spending, which is a sugar rush, and building, which is a foundation. My parents had spent their lives trying to look rich. I was building a life where I could afford to be real. The retaliation I expected, the screaming phone calls, the lawsuits, the doorstep confrontations, never really came. That was the genius of the trust structure. The quiet clause did the work for me. My parents and Claire quickly realized that their stipend, the only lifeline they had left, was tethered to their behavior. If they harassed me, the money stopped. If they sued, the money stopped. If they posted lies about me online, the money stopped. I didn't have to be cruel. I didn't have to destroy them. I just had to let the consequences stand. The trust turned their own greed into my bodyguard. They couldn't punish me anymore because I no longer needed their permission to breathe, and they couldn't afford to make me angry. The silence from their end wasn't out of respect, it was out of necessity. And honestly, I didn't care about the difference. On a Tuesday night in late January, I finished the last of the paperwork. I was back in my own apartment. The heating bill was paid. The fridge was full. My phone was silent because I had blocked the numbers that hurt me, and the legal threats were being intercepted by a lawyer who scared them more than they scared me. I walked to the front door and threw the deadbolt. Click. It was a simple physical sound, a piece of metal sliding into place. I went to the kitchen and poured 2 mugs of tea. I set one on the table for myself. I set the other one across from me, empty, a small ritual of acknowledgement for Grandma, who was safe in her own house across town. Outside, the snow was falling again. It came down in heavy wet flakes covering the gray sidewalks, covering the oil stains in the parking lot, covering the tracks of everyone who had walked there before. It fell without caring who deserved what. It just covered the world in white. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug. I looked at the locked door. For the first time in my life, I didn't check the peephole. I didn't listen for footsteps in the hallway. I just sat there watching the steam rise from the tea. I was alone. And finally, I did not feel hunted. And so Donna learned that freedom wasn't a gift, but a carefully constructed boundary protected by a quiet clause. If you enjoyed this journey into corporate and family betrayal, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. We read every single comment of your thoughts on Donna's final decision and the quiet clause. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.